you don't know me, my name is Alyx Dellamonica. I publish fantasy and science fiction under the name A.M. Dellamonica. This is a galley of my newest book, which will be out in 2 weeks. It's called A Daughter of No Nation. It is the second in a trilogy. The first book is called Child of a Hidden Sea, and it was a finalist for the Lambda Award this year. I was quite surprised by that because, as I told several people, it was way less gay than my previous books. But it was cool anyway, obviously. The trio is about an underwater videographer from San Francisco with a master's degree in wildlife biology who falls into a magical world. I sometimes call them Narnia for grown-ups. She's named Sophie, and in the first book she gets to explore the world a little and notices that it has immense biodiversity, which intrigues her, and magic, which baffles her. And then she gets deported. So in A Daughter of No Nation, she does get to go back, and she immediately becomes embroiled in another sort of series of mysteries. And what I'm going to read to you today comes from sort of the later part of the novel. She and her brother and her half-sister and a number of friends have been trying to basically get something out of her birth father and have thus gotten involved in a sort of an odd mystery. And they've eventually ended up going to an island nation called Isla Morta, which is one of those sort of dire places where they really only have male monks who think that, sex and food and anything that gives you pleasure is probably very suspect, and you should really just spend your life singing praises to the dead and apologizing for the wrongs you may have done them. And this guy that Sophie's very interested in, Captain Garland Parrish of the sailing vessel they're on, the Nightjar, grew up there, and like many people who grow up in escape home, he doesn't much care for going back. So they're sort of starting to get to that phase where they're like, yeah, I like you too. And it's complicated because her teenage half-sister is miserably in love with Parrish, and she's dealing with it as only a 17-year-old can, by being horrible, which is what I would have done at her age. So this is from chapter 23. Parrish has asked her to go on a walk with him, and Verena, the sister, is in a bit of a strop. Parrish looked at the bunch of them rolling out the bedrolls and blankets in the cabin. Bram, Verena, would you mind setting up camp? The village is safe enough. The wood children will shout if there's a specter coming. And me, Sophie said. Verena flinched. There's something I want to show you, Parrish said. Her half-sister turned away, clearly furious. Coming? Where? It's on the trail to hell. Excuse me? The capital, but we're not going that far. Sophie followed. Your capital is called Hell. Of course it is. The two of them proceeded to what she thought of as the back wall of the monastery, and she saw the gateway into the caves. It was covered by a double door, red in color, that reminded her of a barn. Parrish ignored this, leading her instead to a rickety-looking staircase that climbed another trail, switchbacks rising high up the mountain. It was a steep climb, one that conveniently left no breath for casual conversation. In time, it took them up to a cliff's edge so sharp and square and level that it might have been cut by a diamond saw. She could see all the way to the village, the harbor far below. Planted at 3-meter intervals along the cliff's edge were poplar trees, straight of trunk and perhaps 75 feet tall. Their trunks were carved or otherwise shaped to form figures, humans, all with their bare feet planted squarely on the lip of the cliff. White roots dangled over the edge from their toes, bone white and hairy as rats' tails. The woody arms exploded upwards in bursts that might, in abstract art, have been hands, long, thin branches like fingers reaching skyward. The poplars were covered in leaves that at first glance reminded Sophie of peacock feathers. They had that false eye that many species used to deter predators. She looked at the trees carefully, then turned to Garland. More oddities? Yes. He led her to the second last in the line, a woman, whose wooden face gazed serenely out to sea. People held here under the hostage concession sometimes opt to be altered in this fashion. They can look out at the world they've left behind. Well, it's reckoned to be less painful than permanent homesickness, or even constant boredom. I can see that, I guess, she said dubiously. This, he said, delicately. Then he cleared his throat and started again. Sophie, this individual is my mother, Sophie Parrish. Her jaw dropped a little. But you brought me to meet your mom? He nodded. What is going on with him today? But the answer to that was obvious. He was essentially visiting a grave, and yet the woman wasn't dead. No wonder he hated coming home. Can she hear me? Do I say hi? Stronia never learned to speak Fleet. So how do you say hello on Isla Morta? Actually, it sounds about the same. Parrish. The most appropriate greeting would be Vaspa dene memane. That sounds Russian. He shrugged. I don't know Russian. She repeated the phrase and then looked at him. What now? He added a few phrases of his own, starting with Zolfi Hansa and going on for a second longer. The accent definitely had a Russian sound. Gail's name figured in his monologue, too. Are you telling her that Gail died? He gave her an odd half-smile and seemed unable to speak. The tree's not-carved face didn't move, but its branches shuddered in the wind, and the eyes on the leaves all seemed suddenly to be looking at her. You know what? I'm going to give you guys a minute. She gestured at a thread of trail heading upward. Take a javelin, he said, and she did. His mom's a tree. A dryad? A naiad? She wasn't up on her fairy tales. I should have played more D&D in college instead of volunteering to go shoot wildlife for every ethologist with a research grant and a boat. Once the transformed trees were out of sight, the trail she had chosen might have been any little strip of land in the Pacific Northwest. It led upward to another little shelf of rock, another viewpoint. This one had a tumbled plate of stone, much like those that led across the marsh, lying like a table on the land. She hitched herself up onto it as if it were an oversized bench and set herself to watching the landscape. From up here, the harbor, encircled as it was by land on one side and the skull planters with their redwood trees, looked like a lake. Shifting clouds of crows moved in the trees, giving the perimeter of the foliage a black, mobile border. After about 10 minutes, Parrish appeared, moving silently. Something in the bush caught his eye, and his hand darted out. He brought it to the table, laying it there. A white spider the size of his thumb tumbled onto the stone table. Crab spider. Blends in well with the lichen, she said. Nice specimen. You've seen it then. She nodded. So, she laid down a pause. He didn't pick it up. Your mother's a tree. He seemed to be considering where to start. It's customary for all the island nations to send a certain number of children to the fleet each year. Isla Morta, as you deduced, has a low birth rate. The monks generally buy and then free a number of willing adolescent slaves from the Isle of Fury. But my mother always intended me for the fleet, and when I was gone, he made a gesture indicating the cliff below. You didn't know she was planning to get transformed? In retrospect, I might have guessed. He let out a long sigh. I wanted to go. The fleet sounded magical, a chance to live, to see the world. Why'd you quit? I was expelled. She remembered suddenly. Clyde had said he'd been disgraced. I'm sorry. It was a long time ago, and it led to, he pointed down at the harbor, at Nightjar, all those years with Gail. I'm not sorry. They sat in silence looking out over the ocean. Over the ocean, the clouds. It was deliciously quiet. The air was just verging on cool, and the sky was dotted with high cirrus spread like fish scales across the blue. The air smelled of cedar and ponderosa pine, and after weeks at sea, it was nice to be somewhere so still and rooted. After matters with Beatrice resolve, he asked, you'll return home? I don't know. I need to be here. But how do I give up everything? Plus, I'm endangering Bram. He nodded, indicating assent and understanding, his total lack of a good answer. You don't bullshit people, she thought, admiringly. It was a rare gift. Impulsively, she reached over, taking his hand. She'd meant to just squeeze and let go. Well, probably meant to anyway. But his fingers turned in hers, intertwining, and a jolt went through her. She hadn't really thought this through, and now he was holding on. And it wasn't as though she wanted to wrench free. He introduced me to his mom. Took me home to Mother. Parrish shifted so they were face to face and put out his free hand, fingers brushing her cheek. His gaze was so steady it felt like a dissection. Sophie's mind whirled through a dozen possible things to say and came up dry. That one hand continued its tour of her cheek, resting briefly under her chin, and when she didn't break away, he curled his fingers back, brushing the nape of her neck and pausing there. She shivered. The space between them had closed. She didn't remember getting closer, didn't remember him moving, but he was inches away now, and one totally unwelcome thought ran through her mind. Bram, you little shit, you could have just said he liked me back instead of teasing me about having a crush. Then Parrish was kissing her. It was unhurried, sweet, the contact laced with a strange abundance of gravitas. Just one long kiss, then he pulled back. To what? Check she was okay with it? Okay. Let's brush that crab spider off the stone table and, Sophie, he said. She returned the kiss with a lot less solemnity, then broke away. Yes? If you're amenable. Yes, I'm amenable, she thought. If anything, she was too amenable. I'd very much like to court you. Don't laugh, don't laugh. He's sticking his neck out here. If by court you mean... A crashing off to their left interrupted her. Parrish had his javelin out and her behind him in a second. The oldest ambulatory person Sophie had ever seen in her life came battering his way out of the deep bush, dressed in a tattered black robe and smelling of manure and wood smoke. It smacked the javelin away and then slapped Parrish hard across the face. Garland! It had a voice like a tea kettle. What are you doing? Unhand that female immediately, you lecher! Chapter 24. No sex for you guys today.
At least there's some food.
There's chocolate, but no sex. Parrish broke into that infectious, delighted smile. Brother, no! Horrified, steam whistle shriek. I'm one of the nameless now. I have let the last shred of proud individuality, the stranger mind releasing something to the wind. Shame on you, mating here like Corinthians, and your mother, what, 50 meters away? This is a place of contemplation and penance, Garland. You, of all people, should know what happens when we give in to our base urges. Brother No Name was clearly an extremist, even by the monastery's standards, believing not only in no sex, but no hygiene, and possibly no food. Mortification of the flesh he left to the environment. Under his ratty robe, Sophie could see his pallid, leathery flesh was covered in scratches and bites. Parrish seemed thrilled to find him alive, even though the monk switched to the language of Issel Morta and began haranguing him in a piercing whistle. The sermon went on for so long that Sophie began to doubt what had passed before. Had Parrish really kissed her? Maybe they were at a higher altitude than she thought. What could a person like Parrish possibly mean by courting? Speak fleet, Parrish begged. Vesmatala, sleep in a bed, do you? 3 meals a day? I'm very comfortable, yes. Now that Verdani spy who enthralled you is finally gone to ash and story, you could return to the forest and repay your debt to the dead. The brother was opposed to my going to Fleet, Parrish explained, by way of including her. Only one who was. His mother, old brother Cray, the boy himself, all mad to fling him to the sea, and look how that turned out. Sailing hither and yon, no home, all to keep that scandalous woman alive. And now you seem to have picked up a new one. Here, Sophie got a significant glance. Righting wrongs and saving lives. He shouldn't right wrongs. Death finds us all, girl. That woman was doomed, double doomed from birth. Meaning what? Why fight fate? Why rush it? Exactly. He beamed at her, snaggle-toothed. His breath was eye-wateringly rotten. Parrish said, I'm at peace with my current circumstances, my past actions too. I won't have you rutting like a red-capped silver stag while you're home. Your word on it, Garland. He didn't try to hide the smile. I am sorry we offended you. That's no promise. The monk brightened. Well, you stink of lust. I'd better stick around to stiffen your resolve. Are you hellbound? No, back to ossuary. He wriggled between them like a 5-year-old, almost as light, bony as scythes, and his robes greasy with filth. Let's go! Thus chaperoned, they marched back down the mountainside in near silence. At least one monk failed to hide an expression of dismay at the sight of the nameless brother. The old man promptly whistled at him. As they stepped back within the confines of the monastery's wall, Sophie took a step toward the red door. But Parrish kept moving, widening his eyes meaningfully and steering towards the cabins where the others were waiting. Who's this? Bram said as they approached the 2 A-frames. Tonio, she saw, had returned. He seemed sober, lost in thought. I found Garland copulating in the woods on his mother's grave. Verena looked as though she'd been slapped. Strictly speaking, Sophie said, that's not. Parrish interrupted. The brother has graciously agreed to join us for the evening. Tonio, may I ask if you concluded your business? I did, Garland, thanks. Did Parrish think Tonio was up to some mischief? What would that entail here? It was almost as elusive a concept in this setting as courting. Would you ask the monks for a wash basin and a fresh robe? Tonio nodded and headed across the compound. Parrish continued, tomorrow we'll wrap up our visit here. He was choosing his words with care. Hiding our purpose, wondered Sophie. Bram, perhaps you can take your sister. He emphasized their relationship none too subtly, so the nameless monk couldn't rise up in ire at the prospect of Sophie going off out of his sight with a man. And see if the 2 of you can arrange for us to have that conversation in the morning? Why me? Bram said, but Sophie hauled him up. When they were out of earshot, she murmured, I'm betting Brother No-Name will disapprove of our waking the dead. Parrish seems to be hoping he won't find out why we're here. And since the guys clamped onto him like a lamprey, it falls to us to make the appointment. Exactly. Makes sense. He looked at her sidelong. So, Soph, don't, Bram. Rotting on Mama's grave? It was a kiss. Also, he wants to court me. Once again, you found yourself on the cutting edge of the 18th century. Anyway, his mom's not dead exactly. She's a transform. Well, that makes all the difference in the world, he said. I will make you eat that magnetometer. She led him to the barn doors she'd seen earlier, knocked until a monk peered out and asked about the defector, high-felling. So I'm going to jump ahead a little here. What's happening is they've been sort of pursuing a little mystery, and they've hit a point where they need to interview a witness, and he's inconveniently dead. On Stormrack, the way magic works is that each island nation has a set of proprietary spells based on its microclimate, and they can write inscriptions using the materials they have at hand. And it means, among other things, that the various nations spend a lot of time suing each other over whose bat belongs to whom and which of them stole what spells. You can write a spell to kill someone. Just bang, they're dead remotely. It's lovely. But all of these inscriptions are essentially contracts with the unknown. And if they are destroyed, the spells revert in whatever way is sort of most convenient for the world around it. So one of the things they do on Isle Morta is they take in the bodies of the magically murdered, and if the scrolls turn up, they keep them as well. They just have them in a vault. So they have come here to ask if they can tear up the scroll for this one guy so they can ask him a bunch of questions about turtles. Now I just need to find it. Yes, chapter 25. Tonio was first to arise the next day, maybe 15 minutes after dawn broke. He sketched a wave and a friendly glance in Sophie's direction, then made his way into the fog, headed for the outhouse. The monks sang as they emerged from their shacks, joining the lone voice who had sung all night. The group of them built a low chord that was unmistakably a lament. Sophie was reminded of the Who's coming out of their homes at Christmas in the old Grinch cartoon. Except, of course, that instead of wahoo and dahu, this was all whoa, whoa, whoa. Sustained musical chords built in complexity as more singers came out, adding mournful notes to the chill. The song rose, rolling through the encampment in the forest, cold and damp like the fog, and even the crows and the wood children seemed to fall silent as the sound permeated everything. The reverberations of sorrow drove the others out of their sleeping bags. Verena appeared, favoring her with a neutral "good morning," and then balancing her leg like a ballet dancer on a crossbar of wood while brushing her hair, preparatory to binding it in the screamingly tight ponytail she favored. "Can I borrow that after you're through?" Sophie said, just to break the silence. "Sure." Short word, bitten off angrily. I shouldn't say anything, Sophie thought, but what came out was, "You know that monk totally overstated what Parrish and I—" "It's none of my business," Verena said. So much for making it up. The men appeared one by one, Bram wide awake as always, with no apparent need for a transition between deep sleep and full consciousness. Then Parrish, clad in his white shirt and a pair of Bram's bike shorts. His eyes found hers just as she was taking in his bedhead. He barely smiled in response. She felt a schoolgirl flutter, and then, a moment later, a deeper, more internal response. Verena broke their gaze by walking between them, proffering the hairbrush. "Your turn." Sophie took it. "Thanks. Is there anything else of mine that you want?" She felt herself coloring. I'm good, thanks." "Yeah, you sure do." Verena didn't move, just stood there between her and Parrish. Sophie ran the brush through her curls. "I need a haircut," she said, inanely, just to make a sound. "Done?" Verena held her hand out pointedly. Sophie returned the brush. "Verena," Parrish said, and she turned rapidly, teeth all but bared. "Might I?" "Keep it." She shoved it blindly into his hand and took off. Tonio bit his lip. "Someone should." "I'll go after her," Bram said. "Garland, will they feed us?" "Not in any way we're likely to appreciate." "Let's resurrect the saboteur, charm the truth out of him, and get going, shall we?" "Agreed. Where's your governess?" Sophie laughed. "If you'd like Brother No-Name to reappear, I'm sure all Parrish and I would have to do is step into one of the cabins together." "He crept out late," Parrish said. "He may find sleeping under a roof uncomfortable after living in the wild." They repacked their things. Bram returned with Verena, who threw them all a sullen "sorry," and went inside to sort her bags. The chorus was wrapping up when the monk they had spoken to yesterday approached. "Fortunate morning to you all," he said, breaking the somber mood with a great beaming grin that suggested that, given the slightest encouragement, he'd hug them. "How was your night?" His fleet accent was different from Brother No-Name's. He said "neat" for night. His arms bore scars from some terrible long-ago accident, hooks and drag marks that had left his hand twisted so that it hung backward. He had holes in his ears, marks left by piercings, jewelry he no longer wore. Not a native, Sophie deduced. He'd come from another island. He rapped on the red lacquered crypt doors, and a white-robed monk pushed them wide, letting them into a stone atrium little bigger than a cloakroom and lit by torches. The room was bare, and its floor was carved with words in 100 or more languages. Those she recognized seemed to be words and phrases of farewell. Goodbye, safe journey, good luck to you. At the end of this textual carpet was a path leading down into a narrow corridor, so steep the wooden rungs or stalkers had been hung or affixed to the stone, making of it an amalgam of staircase, ladder, and path into blackness. She could hear Bram breathing heavily, slowly, controlling his not-so-latent claustrophobia. It wasn't usually so bad, but he was drawing Verena's attention, obliging her to caretake a little. St. Bram, taking her mind off Parrish, Sophie thought, "I don't deserve you." The air coming up from the shaft was fresh, cold, and ever so slightly wet. Cave breath, she called it, the moisture that permeated systems that lay atop fast-moving underwater rivers. "We've had the Sylvaner brought to an audience chamber," Brother Piper said. "Follow me." Sophie raised her light and camera, capturing the text on the floor before stepping eagerly onto the incline. The stone underfoot was slick, and the passage led down a good long way, about 30 vertical feet, she estimated, then ended in a shaft that might have been a train tunnel, lined on both sides by regular round chambers, each barely illuminated. Brother Piper managed the incline nimbly, smiling encouragement up at the others before leading them along the corridor. It was punctuated by random boulders above and below, and he'd utter a cheery "watch your head" or "mind your toes" with about every third step. They arrived in a space that was brighter by several orders of magnitude than the corridor, dominated by a pool on the floor that appeared to be filled with bioluminescent dinoflagellates in fresh water. The glow emanated upward, bouncing off a big silver bowl, newly shined, set into the ceiling. Sophie took a slow circle of the room, recording everything, before homing in on the body. Highfelling had been laid on a carved stone couch angled much like a recliner, with a chest strap to hold him in place. Under the belt, he was clad in a long white robe. Beside him was a low table with bamboo cups of cold water and a steaming urn of what smelled like rosehip tea. He was unmistakably dead, but, as advertised, he had not decayed. The smell in the air reminded Sophie of something in a butcher's shop, meat nearing its expiration date, but not quite past it. Tonio took a position as far from the corpse as he could, quietly muttering what she guessed was a prayer in Arinthian. Brother Piper rang a bell, held his hands over the dinoflagellate pool, then washed them in a nearby basin before holding them over the body. Are we half past?
Yep.
Oh, so sorry, folks. I did time this out. They get him alive. It's kind of creepy, and then the monk shows up and stabs him through the heart because he doesn't believe in resurrection.